All right, for those of you joining us at home, we were talking about allopatric speciation, which requires an ancestral population to be divided either by a barrier or by dispersal to a new habitat across a barrier that the population cannot routinely get across. Peripatric speciation, we'll see some examples of that on Monday. That's what you get when populations get isolated on the fringe of an ancestral species range, right on the edge. The habitat for a particular species may be kind of patchy, and you might get very small populations on the edge of a large one getting isolated from the main one. We probably should wait till Monday to go into that in more detail. If you don't have a physical barrier to speciation, it's called sympatric. Sym, of course, is the prefix meaning together. Shared fatherland. Fatherland is together. There's no barrier. And it turns out there's a lot of cases where this has happened in the plant kingdom, not as many in the animal kingdom. That are due to chromosomal causes. Dr. Noyes knows more about this than I do, but the things that plants can get up to with their chromosomes can be downright perverted. And plants in particular can undergo speciation very quickly in 1 or 2 generations through hybridization and through polyploidy. Polyploidy is, of course, a increase in the number of every chromosome. So you go from diploid to triploid is when you have 3 of each chromosome. Tetraploid is when you have 4 of each chromosome, and so on. And if that happens because of errors in meiosis, you can end up with a plant that's got double the number of chromosomes of its parents and can't backcross with its parents. In hybridization, you sometimes will get 2 species of plants that will hybridize, and they will produce a third that cannot backcross with either parent. This is less common in animals, but we do have examples of both. They do happen in the animal kingdom. But a shockingly large number of vascular plants have arisen through either polyploidy or hybridization, or as we'll see, both can sometimes take place. And this can happen within just 1 generation, and we've seen it. In fact, a number of our cultivated plant species, our crops, are in fact hybrids and or polyploids. There used to be some debate back in the 80s as to whether sympatric speciation could happen gradually, whether you could have a population that's just kind of split into 2 without any sort of barrier. It now seems to be accepted that it can happen under the right circumstances, and it may be more common than we previously suspected. But let's look at, first of all, this instant speciation. Gesundheit. There are cases where 2 plant species can hybridize, and they will produce a variety that's not like either parent, and the new variety may not be cross-fertile with either parent. So if you have a hybrid that doesn't look like either parent and can't interbreed with either parent, as long as it can reproduce with itself, then you really don't have any other choice but to call it a new species. And again, we've been able to duplicate this in the laboratory, and a surprisingly large number of crops, for example, are hybrids. You can also get polyploidy if there's an error in meiosis. If you end up with, let's say, a sperm that is diploid instead of haploid, and that diploid sperm fertilizes a haploid egg, you can end up with a triploid. Triploids are often sterile, but sometimes you can end up with a diploid egg fertilizing a diploid sperm, and you end up with a tetraploid, which may be fertile, and so on. And that new polyploid may not be cross-fertile with either parental species. An estimated 15% of flowering plant species and 31% of ferns are estimated to have arisen by relatively recent polyploidy, by errors in meiosis that end up doubling the number of chromosomes. So in plants, it's actually a very common evolutionary dynamic. This is probably partly why the organism with the largest number of chromosomes, believe it's 1,260, and that's actually a rather insignificant looking plant called the adder's tongue fern, which is the kind of thing you step right over and didn't realize it was there. It apparently likes living, I'm told, it likes living among the grasses in places like cemeteries, but it's small enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you went very carefully looking for it. And yet it's got 1,260 chromosomes per normal cell. Dang. And you can see this when you compare closely related species whose chromosome numbers turn out to be small integer multiples of each other. So this is genus Chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum segatum, I believe that is an Asian species, and I cannot remember what the name for it is, but the leaves are edible, and they're used in Japanese cooking, although I can't remember what the Japanese name for them is. And its diploid chromosome number happens to be 18. Chrysanthemum coronarium doesn't look grossly different from Chrysanthemum segatum. You know, still nice composite flower, same basic petal shape and all that. But it happens to have a diploid chromosome number of 36. And then Chrysanthemum indicum is the one that's usually cultivated as a garden plant. You might have chrysanthemums in your garden, or you know, maybe your mom or your grandma does. You know, I've bought potted chrysanthemums for my wife before because she likes flowers, and the diploid chromosome number is 54. And so it's not that uncommon to find this situation where you'll have a bunch of plants that are in the same genus and that may not look grossly different from each other, and yet it turns out that their chromosome numbers are small integer multiples of each other, right? 18, 36, and 54. That's pretty good evidence that some of these species arose through polyploidy, through errors of meiosis, giving you offspring that have entire extra sets of chromosomes. In animals, there are cases of this. It doesn't seem to be, I mean, the case I'm thinking of is, I don't know if you have heard of genus Xenopus, Xenopus. It's the African clawed frog. It's used a lot as a model organism in studying things like development. So if you go on to study more cell bio, developmental biology, endocrinology, things like that, you will encounter Xenopus again. But I believe there are something like 20 species of Xenopus, and they range from species that are diploid to species that are dodecaploid. 12 of each chromosome instead of diploid, which is of course 2 of each chromosome. So there's cases where you get this in the animal kingdom, but it seems to be overall much more rare. Very occasionally, you will get humans that are triploid, that are born with 3 of each chromosome instead of 2. They are usually severely, what's the word I'm looking for? Severely disrupted. Most usually, they're stillborn. If they are born, they don't survive very long. Certainly for humans, having extra copies of the complete genome just wrecks your development. It upsets some kind of delicate balance that you need to develop the standard human phenotype. But plants do this sort of thing all the time. Just here's another example. On the left is Anemone rivularis. Anemone is a flower. The common name is windflower. By the way, sea anemones are animals, but they're called that because they look like ocean versions of land anemones. And if you look carefully at the karyotype of Anemone rivularis, and then compare it with the karyotype of a different species, Anemone quinquefolia, the plants are clearly similar. The flowers are very similar. The only real difference is a difference in petal number. And yet quinquefolia not only has double the number of chromosomes, it's got double the number of chromosome types. Right? If you look carefully, you can match up the chromosomes of quinquefolia with rivularis, and quinquefolia basically has a double set of rivularis type chromosomes. Right? Rivularis has, what? I count 6 chromosomes that have the centromere very far towards the end. That's called being aquacentric. Quinquefolia's got 12. Rivularis has 2 chromosomes that are centric and kind of short. Quinquefolia's got 4. And then Rivularis has 7 chromosomes that are centric and long. Quinquefolia's got 14. And so on. So you can work this out by looking not just at chromosome number, but chromosome shape. The weird thing is that sometimes this doesn't seem to drive speciation. You would have seen a lot of these in April and May. This is a very common spring wildflower, Claytonia virginica, aka the spring beauty, and it seems to thrive a lot on older lawns. Not your suburbs that got put in a couple of years ago, but if you drive around and look at houses in the older neighborhoods of Conway, especially the ones that don't get mowed at the drop of a hat, a lot of them will have spring beauties coming up amid the grass. They're quite pretty. They're not very big flowers, but they've got these pretty white petals with the pink lines. It turns out that Claytonia virginica comes in 3 diploid, quote, races, whose diploid chromosome number can be 12, 14, or 16. And it exists in polyploid form all the way up to 2n equals 191. And yes, that's an odd number. I'm not sure how they do it. As far as I've been able to find, this doesn't seem to form any barrier towards interbreeding. Claytonias with different chromosome numbers can interbreed and seemingly produce fertile offspring, and I really have no idea why. Plants are just weird. Plants are just, like I said, they're pretty perverted when it comes to the tricks that their chromosomes play. So yeah, think of that next time you're driving past a Conway lawn in May and you have all these beautiful flowers popping up. They're total freaks as far as chromosomes go. Can we make this happen in the lab? Well, we've talked about polyploidy. Now let's talk about hybridization. In 1928, Soviet Union has great scientist, Gennady Karpachenko. Karpachenko wishes to breed super vegetable. Super vegetable will have big, tasty leaves like cabbage, and also big, tasty root like radish. So tries to crossbreed radish and cabbage. For glory of Soviet Union, wishes to breed super Soviet, super vegetable. So Russians have lots of borscht and lots of sheep. Sheep is very good. Sheep is cabbage soup in Russia, very tasty. And we want to make lots of sheep with radish added, so he crossbreed vegetable. And I'll stop the goofy accent, sorry about that. Now here's the thing, they're in the same family. Radish and cabbage are a different genera, but they're both in the mustard family. They're both in the family Brassicaceae. And both of them have a diploid chromosome number of 18. Now, if you cross them, normally, the cabbage would contribute 9 chromosomes, and the radish would contribute 9 chromosomes, right? And you should get an offspring with 18. Yes? It should work, but normally those hybrids are sterile because the 9 cabbage chromosomes cannot pair up just right with the 9 radish chromosomes. So normally if you do this, you do get hybrids, but they're sterile hybrids. However, if you keep doing this often enough, occasionally you will get, because of an error in meiosis, you'll get a diploid egg. And occasionally in meiosis, you'll get a diploid sperm. And if you crossbreed lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of radishes and cabbages with each other, eventually, given enough time and enough patience, you'll manage to crossbreed a diploid egg with a diploid sperm. Right? With me there? And when that happens, what you now have is a hybrid plant, a hybrid F1, that has 2 copies of each cabbage chromosome and 2 copies of each radish chromosome. Right? That plant's going to be fertile because when it carries out meiosis, each cabbage chromosome can pair up with another cabbage chromosome. Each radish chromosome can pair up with another radish chromosome. Every chromosome finds a pair, crossing over takes place normally, and everybody's happy. Right? With me there? So if you crossbreed radish and cabbage, most of the time you will get sterile F1 hybrids. Wait around long enough and keep trying, and eventually you'll get a fertile F1 hybrid, because that fertile F1 hybrid will have come from a diploid egg fusing with a diploid sperm. So that fertile F1 will have 2 of each cabbage chromosome, 2 of each radish chromosome, and the chromosomes can all pair up. By the way, this is called allotetraploidy. Allo, again, means different. Tetra means 4. You've got 4 of each chromosome, but half your chromosome, but the chromosomes are coming from 2 different parents, hence allotetraploidy. So yeah, basically all you have to do is just get a big field, grow cabbages and radishes and crossbreed them like crazy, and eventually you'll get a fertile F2. And the F2 can, of course, reproduce, and you can breed more and more and more plants from that F2, and you get a stable lineage that has 2 radish chromosomes, 2 of each radish chromosome and 2 of each cabbage chromosome. It will not easily backcross with radishes or with cabbages. It can't backcross to either parent very well, but it can cross with itself. and propagate itself. And the only thing you can really call it is a new species, a fertile plant that can't backcross with either parent and doesn't look like either parent. Karpachenko create super vegetable, great triumph of Soviet Union science. His name is Rafano brassica. Raphanus is radish, brassica is cabbage. Rafano brassica means radabish, right? Part radish, part cabbage, we say radabish. I believe now is actually called Brassica raphanus, but he called Rafano brassica. Unfortunately, Rafano brassica was not a super vegetable. We have saying in Russia that translates as nature is stupid, fate is a turkey, and life is worth a penny. Natura dura sudba indieka, жизнь копейка. And turned out to be true. Karpachenko wanted big leaves of cabbage with root of radish. Just what he got. You want cabbage leaves with radish root.
Radish leaves and cabbage.
Конечно, exactly. Точно так, he got radish leaves and cabbage root. He did not get the super vegetable he was hoping for. It is still propagated, and it's got some use as a fodder crop, something you can grow and make silage out of and feed to your livestock. So it hasn't been lost. This is a whole bunch of Rafana brassica growing in a field. Karpachenko, unfortunately, in Soviet Union, was a geneticist and also Ukrainian, I believe, ended in Gulag. Очень жалко. There was actually, literally in the years of Stalin, there was persecution of Orthodox geneticists. This fraud by the name of Trofim Lysenko got Stalin's ear and claimed that he could create super Soviet agriculture and everybody else was completely wrong. And an awful lot of brilliant geneticists ended up getting shot or dying in the gulags, the labor camps. And I think that may have been what happened to Karpachenko. But that's an example of allotetraploidy. You can cross two different species, and sometimes you'll get fertile F1 hybrids. Sometimes you don't, but if you can cross them enough that you get, by luck, a diploid egg fusing with a diploid sperm, you can get a new plant variety that arose from two parental species and can breed, but can't backcross with either parent, and you've got a new species there. This has actually happened in the wild, and a beautiful example of how it's happened was worked out by a guy named Loren Reisberg, who I believe at the time was at the University of Nebraska. Or was it U of Kansas? I forget. Anyway, out there on the prairies, one of the most prominent flowers that you'll see are sunflowers, genus Helianthus. One of the first plants on this continent to be domesticated, by the way, something on the order of 3,000 years ago, there were Native American populations that were domesticating sunflowers and breeding them for bigger seeds, you know, tastier and oilier and more nutrient-rich seeds. Again, that was one of the first wave of domesticated plants in North America. And here's two species, Helianthus annuus, the annual sunflower. That's a wild one, but this is the one that's been domesticated. This is the ancestor of like the great big sunflower that's growing outside the back door of this building right now. Anybody see it as you come in? If you come in through, if you go out this hallway and go out through that back door, the one that's closest to the baseball stadium, there's a big sunflower growing right outside the door, and that's Helianthus annuus. You can cross it with Helianthus petiolaris, the prairie sunflower. And there's a rare wild species of sunflower called Helianthus anomalus that was suspected to have evolved from a hybrid of annuus and petiolaris. Now, anomalus is pretty rare because it's an ecological specialist. The parents, annuus and petiolaris, those are prairie plants. And before we plowed it all, there were many, many millions of acres of prairie out in Kansas, Nebraska, the plains states, where sunflowers could flourish. Of course, we've plowed it all up and grow an awful lot of corn and wheat, but that's another story. Helianthus anomalus is an ecological specialist. It's native to sand dunes, not an environment where an awful lot of plants can grow. But Helianthus anomalus can grow there. And it is thought to be a hybrid, but it's different from the parental species because there have been several chromosome fissions and inversions and things like that. If you have a chromosome inversion, that's another error in meiosis in which one piece of a chromosome can actually be spliced in reverse order. You can have a piece of chromosome backwards spliced. Is that? Anybody notice what I just did there? You can have a piece of chromosome backwards spliced. Is that? See, I meant to say you can have a piece of chromosome that is spliced backwards, but I took a part of my sentence and I turned it backwards. Okay, I was impressed. Anyway, whatever. So anomalous cannot easily backcross with either parent because the chromosomes have changed. And you have, compared to the parents, anomalous has a number of points where chromosomes have fused or parts of them have been inverted. Now, what Riesenberg did was he crossed annuus and petiolaris, the two prairie sunflowers that we started with. In the wild, they almost never interbreed. But by propagating them in his lab, he was able to get them to hybridize. And some of his hybrids were fertile. So he created 3 different fertile hybrid lineages that were derived from annuus and petiolaris. And it turned out his hybrids were fertile with Helianthus anomalus, but not fertile with either parent. Let me show you what that data looks like. This is a diagram from his paper. Each one of those lines in this 6-sided star diagram, each one of those lines represents a cross, and the thickness of the lines and the numbers next to the lines represent the percentage of fertile offspring that he got when he made a cross. So if you cross annuus at the lower left and petiolaris at the lower right, those are the 2 wild prairie species that we were talking about. There's a dashed line connecting them, and that number 0.78, that's the percent fertile offspring that you get. So if you cross annuus and petiolaris, less than 1% of the offspring are going to be fertile. Okay, with me there. So annuus and petiolaris are almost completely blocked from interbreeding. Down at the very bottom center, Helianthus anomalus, that's our sand dune sunflower. And Anomalous, if you cross anomalous with annulus and petiolaris, you get 0.16 and 0.18. So 0.16% or 0.18% of those seeds are fertile. So anomalous is almost completely blocked from interbreeding with annulus or with petiolaris. With me there so far? Okay, they're all three almost completely reproductively isolated from each other. But again, Riesberg took annulus and petiolaris, bred them in his lab, and saved the few fertile offspring that he got and propagated them, and ended up with 3 different hybrid lines that he had nurtured in his lab. All 3 of those hybrids are fertile with each other. If you cross any one of the 3 hybrids with another one of the hybrids, you get 70 to 75% of the seeds are going to be fertile. And then if you cross the hybrids with anomalous, you get between 37 and 42% fertility. So see what he's done here. He took these 2 wild species, created hybrids, and the hybrids are not good at back crossing with either parent, but they can cross with anomalous, which we think is descended from a wild hybrid between annulus and petiolaris. What he basically did was recreate a hybrid speciation event. He created these hybrids and showed that they could reproduce sexually with a species that was thought to be a natural hybrid. See what I'm getting at there? And it was basically able to do a repeat, do a repetition of an event that we infer happened in the past. He was able to repeat that event in the present. Isn't that cool? Yeah, it's good stuff. Oh, the really weird thing is that the same parental species, annulus and petiolaris, the ones that we started with, seem to have hybridized in the wild at least 2 more times. So I can read it. So we talked about Helianthus anomalus is the one that lives in sand dunes. Helianthus deserticola lives on the desert floor, lives on sand flats and sandy, rocky, flat habitats. Helianthus paradoxus can tolerate salt marshes in the desert. And again, anomalus, the one we talked about earlier, lives in sand dunes. All 3 of those, anomalus, deserticola, and paradoxus, live in extreme environments that most other plants cannot survive in. Desert salt marshes are pretty rough. And all 3 of these are thought to result from hybridization between the 2 prairie sunflowers that we started with, annulus and petiolaris. So the idea here is that when you get hybridization like this, you're bringing in genetic material from 2 different species, and the odds go up that this combination of genetic material from different species, how do I want to put this? Bringing together genetic material from 2 different species gives you offspring that may be very adaptable, that have diverse alleles, that have genetic resources that neither one of the parents has. And that makes it possible for them to colonize habitats that their parents could never live in, to colonize these extreme habitats, these niches that the parents and most other plants can't live in. So if you crossbreed 2 different species, the idea is that you create new possibilities for evolution by bringing these different genes together, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, as we mentioned, an estimated 15% of angiosperm, that's flowering plants, and 31% of ferns, the speciation is accompanied by polyploidy. If you include more distant polyploids and hybrids, an estimated 70% of your flowering plants are ultimately derived from either polyploids or hybrids, or sometimes both. So this happens all the time in plants. It seems to allow plants to colonize extreme habitats because it generates novel combinations of traits, which sometimes will give a hybrid plant possibilities that its parents did not have. And we make use of this an awful lot in developing crops. Up top is something that was actually worked out by a Korean biologist who was working in Japan and published under his Japanese name. So what you're looking at is called the triangle of Ub. The guy's last name is Korean, but transliterated into Japanese and then transliterated into our alphabet. It's just the letter U, capitalized because it was his last name. So his name was Dr. Ub, and this is the triangle of Ub. There's 3 different wild species, originally wild species in genus Brassica. Brassica rapa is the one that we've domesticated and turned into turnips. Brassica oleracea is the one we've developed into cabbage. And incidentally, Brassica oleracea has also been developed by artificial selection into broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and kohlrabi. So several different vegetables that don't look much like each other all come from Brassica oleracea. But a cross between Brassica rapa, the ancestor of turnips, and Brassica oleracea, the ancestor of cabbage, yielded a species called Brassica napus. If you eat the roots of Brassica napus, that's called, in American English, it's the rutabaga. I believe in Britain, it's sometimes called the swede. But Brassica napus is also grown as an oilseed crop. If you harvest the seeds and press them, you get good cooking oil from them. And Brassica napus seed oil is sold under the trade name canola. Now, rapa is Latin for turnip, and Brassica napus oil used to be referred to as rapeseed oil. Rape not having anything to do with forcible sex, just a word for turnip. But marketers kind of decided in the 60s that no one was going to buy something called rapeseed. So that's why it's sold under the name canola oil. And you can find it under that name in any supermarket. It's a pretty good all-purpose cooking oil. Anyway, if you cross Brassica rapa, turnip, with Brassica nigra, black mustard, you get Brassica juncea, aka yellow mustard. Juncea is grown mostly for its edible greens. If you've ever had mustard greens, it was probably juncea. Both black mustard and yellow mustard, by the way, you can harvest their seeds and grind them up in wine or vinegar or beer and add various spices, and that's how you get the mustard condiment. The stuff you put on your hot dogs, or spread on your hamburger, or put on your pretzels that you're eating with beer. That is ground seeds of either Brassica nigra or Brassica juncea. And incidentally, it's a triangle because if you cross Brassica oleracea with Brassica nigra, that's the third arm of the triangle, and you get a crop called Ethiopian mustard, which is not as widely cultivated, but people do in fact eat it. So you've got 3 different wild species, each of which is hybridized with the other 2 to produce 3 different cultivated species. So there you've got a crop where you have multiple events of hybridization. Cultivated bananas don't have any seeds because they're triploid. Now, you might remember I showed you that little snippet of the Australian evangelist Ray Comfort proving that God must have created the banana because it is perfectly adapted for human needs. I used to have a banana plant growing before my front door back when I lived in New Orleans. And it had a bunch of bananas, and I got the bright idea to try one once. And it was very hard to peel. The flesh tasted like ivory soap, as I recall, and I almost chipped a tooth on all the seeds. Diploid bananas are loaded with seeds, like any fruit. Cultivated ones are seedless because they're either autotriploids of a wild species called Musa acuminata, or they're allotriploids, where each plant will have 2 chromosomes from Musa acuminata and 1 set from Musa balbisiana, or sometimes the other way around. And that triploidy is what means that chromosomes can't pair up, which is why cultivated bananas have no seeds. And it's also why cultivated bananas have to be propagated by cuttings. They can't reproduce sexually. And it's also why Cavendish bananas, which are the type that you're most familiar with, are getting wiped out by a fungus even as we speak. And before Cavendish bananas, the previous variety that was grown for human consumption pretty much got wiped out by an earlier fungus disease, which gets back to our lesson about how sexual reproduction is an anti-pathogen defense because it creates genetic variability. Certain other fruits, it's the same. Seedless watermelons, for example, are triploid hybrids. And a beautiful example is cultivated wheat. Wheat is descended from a bunch of wild grasses that were growing about 10,000 years ago and still grow there in a part of the world called the Fertile Crescent. That's the zone between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Fertile Crescent is now basically southern Iraq, extending around into southern Turkey and hooking down a little bit into what's now Jordan and Israel. That was one of the centers of plant cultivation. There's actually about 20 places in the world where people independently hit upon the idea of cultivating plants and developed agriculture. And the Fertile Crescent's a big one because this is where wheat was domesticated. And the wild wheat that people collected in the Fertile Crescent before they started domesticating it, up there at the top, called wild emmer, Triticum urartu, has a diploid number of 14 chromosomes, 7 pairs. Wild emmer was the first one to be cultivated and naturally selected for, as you can kind of see, bigger seeds. Emmer, I believe, is still grown. Around here, you might be able to find it in some of the more exotic whole grain cereals that you might get at Whole Foods or something like that. If memory serves, it's more common in Germany. They still make some emmer wheat bread, for example. But it's not one you're that likely to have heard of unless you're a serious foodie. But cultivated emmer crossed with a weed in the garden called Aegilops speltoides and gave rise to a hybrid that now has double the number of chromosomes, 2 of each chromosome from emmer and 2 of each from Aegilops. producing a new variety of wheat called Durham wheat. Durham wheat, you know, because Durham wheat is very high in protein. It's very high in gluten. And that means some people, like my wife, can't eat it. But all that gluten means that Durham wheat dough sticks together very, very tightly. And Durham wheat is the preferred variety of wheat for making pasta. If you've ever eaten, you know, you've all had spaghetti or something like that, odds are that was made out of Durham wheat. If you don't have Durham wheat, you can make pasta out of regular flour, but you have to add more protein, usually in the form of an egg. If you've ever had egg noodles, that's why some noodles are made with egg. But you don't need the egg if you've got Durham wheat. Incidentally, we grow a whole lot of Durham wheat in North Dakota. So we do grow this in this country, and you've eaten it. But Durham hybridized with yet another grass that was growing in the neighborhood called Triticum tauschii. And the result is yet another hybrid, Triticum aestivum, that has 2 of each Emmer chromosome and 2 of each Agelops chromosome and 2 of each Triticum tauschii chromosome. Triticum aestivum is bread wheat. This is the one that's grown for the vast majority of flour, unless you deliberately add different grains. Most of the bread you've ever eaten, that flour comes from Triticum aestivum, and it's one of the most important crops in the world. Which means that bread wheat is an allohexaploid. It's got 2 of each chromosome from Emmer, and 2 of each chromosome from Agelops, and 2 of each chromosome from Triticum tauschii. It's got 6 copies of each chromosome. It's descended from 2 hybridization events and has genetic material from 3 ancestral species. Isn't that freaking cool? Are you ever going to think of bread in the same way? You're eating like this crazy hybrid genetic freak. Isn't that great? Okay, clearly you're not showing enormous amounts of enthusiasm, but profit is not without honor and all that. And it's almost noon, so I'm going to have to wrap this up fairly soon. Oh, as if that weren't enough, some clowns recently crossbred bread wheat with rye, genus Sakali. And if you cross bread wheat with rye, they've created an allo-octoploid plant that's got 2 copies of each Emmer chromosome plus 2 copies of each Agelops chromosome plus 2 copies of each tauschii chromosome plus 2 copies of each rye chromosome. So you've got this hybrid resulting from 3 hybridization events between 4 different parents. The resulting grain is called triticale. And I haven't seen it quite take off, but I know I've seen triticale as an ingredient in, again, some of those fancy schmancy breakfast cereals that you could get at Whole Paycheck. So it does have a commercial market. I think it might be very hardy, maybe hardier than even bread wheat is. And you can get food products that contain it. It is edible. More about it than that, I don't know, but it is grown in limited quantities as a commercial crop, triticale. So yeah, that's a hybrid between 4 different ancestral species, carrying 2 of each chromosome from each one of the parents, which makes it an allo-octoploid. Okay, again, this is not nearly as common in animals, but there are some famous cases, and one of them is whip-tailed lizards of the southwestern US, genus Nematophorus. There's a species called Nematophorus neomexicanus, and it turns out that Nematophorus neomexicanus is entirely female, and it is parthenogenetic. Female Nematophorus neomexicanus are able to produce fertile eggs without the intervention of a male. They do need mating in order to be stimulated to release eggs. So two female Nematophorus neomexicanus can mate with each other. They don't exchange genetic material, but the very act of mating stimulates the development of fertile eggs. And it turns out Nematophorus neomexicanus is a hybrid between two other species, between the western whiptail and the little striped whiptail. There's some other cases of this that have been seen in other lizards. So there's a Nematophorus tigris. And when it hybridized with Nematophorus inornatus, the result was the all-female parthenogenetic Nematophorus neomexicanus, the New Mexico whip-tailed lizard. And it's not a sexual species, but if it's reproductively isolated from all other whiptails, and it looks different from all other whiptails, you can't really call it anything but a new species. Okay, I tell you what, I was going to get into other modes of sympatric speciation, but I think I'm going to save that for tomorrow because it is 12:03, and I'm not going to try to drag you through this in the course of the next 7 minutes. So I will go ahead and stop the recording